December 1944. The Ardennes forest lies buried under snow and a fog thick enough to swallow sound whole. A King Tiger commander leans against the open hatch of his tank, sweeping the tree line with binoculars fogged by his own breath. His armor is the thickest that exists on any battlefield in Europe. Somewhere out there, behind stone walls and the burned frames of barns, American guns are waiting for him. According to every intelligence briefing he has read for the past 6 months, those guns cannot hurt him at this range. He believes it completely. He is wrong. He has been wrong for almost 3 months now, and so were hundreds of German tank commanders before him. Most of them never lived long enough to learn otherwise. This is the story of a weapon the German army did not know existed on the battlefield until it was already too late to matter. A 90mm gun mounted on an American tank destroyer that could kill at ranges no American vehicle had ever managed before. For 4 months, German intelligence officers looked directly at this weapon in reconnaissance photographs and captured wrecks, and somehow never saw it for what it was. To understand that failure, we go back 4 months earlier, to a sunken lane in Normandy, where the old rules of this war were still getting American soldiers killed. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. How many years young are you today? It is August the 7th, 1944. A sunken lane east of the Norman town of Mortain, cut deep between hedgerows that have stood since before any man now fighting there was born. A Sherman tank from the 743rd Tank Battalion shudders to a halt behind a stand of apple trees, its engine ticking as it cools. Above the town, on the high open shoulder of ground the men call Hill 314, soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division are dug into what little cover the bare slope offers, watching the valley below fill with fog and smoke. The air inside the tank smells of hot oil, cordite, and the sour sweat of 5 men who have not slept in 2 days. Outside, the fog has not yet burned off the low ground, and it carries with it the particular smell of a Normandy summer soured by war, crushed apples rotting where they fell weeks ago, the Swedish rot of something dead in the next field, wood smoke from a farmhouse still smoldering from the night's shelling. Somewhere above them, on the bald crown of Hill 314, men who have had nothing to eat in 2 days and almost nothing to drink are watching the same fog and waiting for it to lift enough to call in artillery on whatever is moving below. 300 yards east, through gaps torn in the hedge by a week of shell fire, the Sherman's gunner finds them. Panthers, 5 or 6, moving in column along the road that drops down from the high ground to the north. Behind them come more, and behind those, half-tracks loaded with grenadiers. This is the leading edge of a German counterattack the planners in Berlin have named Operation Lüttich, thrown together in secrecy and launched in the dark hours before dawn with a single desperate purpose: cut through the American lines, reach the coast at Avranches, and sever the armies now pouring out of Normandy from the supply lines feeding them. The gunner lays his sight on the lead Panther. His range card, strapped to his thigh in a plastic sleeve gone soft with sweat, reads 900 yards. He fires. The 75mm shell leaves the barrel at better than 2,000 feet a second and crosses the distance in under 3 seconds, striking the Panther's sloped front plate almost dead center. It does not go through. The shell shatters against the armor in a pale orange flash, fragments spinning away into the ditch grass, and the Panther does not even check its pace. This is the lesson American tank crews have been absorbing the hard way for 2 months now, from the beaches of Omaha to the hedgerows around St. Lo. Fire at the front of a German tank and watch the rounds skip away like a stone thrown across cold water. The Sherman commander keys his intercom and screams a single word: back. The driver throws the transmission into reverse, but reverse in a 30-ton tank is not a fast thing, and the Panther's gunner needs only a few seconds to correct his own aim. His long gun fires from just over 1,000 yards, and the round passes through 3.5 inches of rolled steel, as though it were canvas. There are 5 men inside the Sherman. Perhaps 3 of them will live long enough to climb out through the smoke, stumbling half-blind into the ditch grass with their uniforms smoldering, ears ringing so badly they will not hear another clear sound for days. Across the entire Mortain front that morning, the same scene repeats itself in different lanes and different fields, again and again. By nightfall, the Americans will still be holding Hill 314, and the German counterattack will have failed, not because American tanks outfought German ones in any of these individual duels, but because American artillery falling without pause, American fighter bombers working the roads whenever the weather breaks, and the sheer weight of American numbers grind the attack to a halt, regardless of what happens gun to gun. But it is the tank-to-tank arithmetic of that single day that travels up the chain of command, typed into after-action reports that keep repeating the same phrases. Ammunition ineffective at observed range. Vehicle lost to a single round. Frontal aspect. The officers reading those reports far behind the line do not need an engineer to explain what the words mean. Their tanks cannot kill German tanks from the front, at any range where a German tank cannot also kill them first. There is, however, a gun that can change that arithmetic. It already exists. At this very moment, it is being built on an assembly line in Michigan, and for reasons that trace back nearly 3 years, it has not been allowed anywhere near this battlefield. To understand why, we have to go back to a quiet office in the Pentagon, and to one man who, more than any other single American officer, decided how the United States Army would fight enemy tanks. His name is Leslie McNair, 61 years old that summer, a small and soft-spoken man whose eyesight and hearing had never fully recovered from an artillery burst that caught him in the First World War. He is not a man given to bluster or public argument. Officers who work under him describe a quiet, almost professorial figure who prefers a memorandum to a shouting match, who trusts numbers on a page over stories brought back from the front by younger men he suspects of exaggeration. As commanding general of Army Ground Forces, every tank destroyer battalion in the Army answers, in the end, to a doctrine McNair himself helped write. That doctrine holds that tanks are not built to fight other tanks. A tank's job, in McNair's view, is to exploit a breakthrough once it has been made, to tear through soft infantry and supply columns behind the front. When enemy armor appears, a separate force built for exactly one purpose is supposed to find it and kill it. Fast and lightly armored vehicles meant to ambush from a hidden position, fire twice, and vanish before the enemy can shoot back. Never meant to stand and slug it out with a Panther at 400 yards in an open field. On paper, in a planning room in 1941, the idea has a certain elegance. By the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, it is falling apart, because the German army has not read the American doctrinal manuals and refuses to cooperate with any of it. Instead of the massed armored spearheads McNair's tank destroyer battalions were built to ambush, the Germans defend in depth with dug-in anti-tank guns that are nearly impossible to spot, and counterattack with Panthers that simply outrange and outgun almost everything McNair's doctrine has provided to stop them. That spring, before the invasion, ordnance officers had already proposed stripping the standard 75mm gun out of the Sherman and replacing it with something far more powerful, a 90mm weapon capable of punching through German armor at genuine combat ranges. McNair refused the proposal, citing test data collected the previous year at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, data that showed the newer 76mm gun, a lesser upgrade already approved, penetrating captured Panther armor plates at what should have been more than adequate ranges. On the strength of that data, McNair concluded the existing gun, once modestly improved, was good enough. What those Aberdeen tests had not shown, and what nobody in the American Army discovered until actual Panthers began appearing in the fields of Normandy, was that German armor plate of that period was face-hardened in a way that caused American shells to shatter on impact rather than punch cleanly through, a metallurgical behavior the test plates back in Maryland simply had not reproduced. The data itself was flawed, and the doctrine built on top of that data was flawed with it. On a hot afternoon in late July, McNair still does not know any of this. He has flown to Normandy to observe Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive he helped design, executed now at full scale along a narrow stretch of front near the village of La Chapelle. Cobra opens with the heaviest tactical bombing raid of the war in the West. More than 1,500 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force crossing overhead in wave after wave. Some aircraft release their bombs early. One crew drops nearly 1,000 yards short of the intended target. Others follow the same fatal error, and the bombs meant for German positions fall instead among the American infantry dug in below, and into the observation area where McNair himself has taken shelter in a narrow slit trench. A bomb lands beside him. The crater that engineers find afterward measures more than 3 yards across and better than 3 yards deep. McNair is identified only by the 3 silver stars still pinned to his collar and by his West Point class ring. He becomes that afternoon the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat anywhere in the Second World War, and he is killed by his own Air Force, on the very battlefield his own doctrine was supposed to be winning. His death does not, by itself, create a single new tank destroyer. The program that will eventually bear the fruit everyone in Normandy so badly needs already belongs to a different man, Major General Andrew Bruce, a Texan and a First World War veteran who has spent years pushing the tank destroyer concept forward against real skepticism inside his own army, and who already has the first examples of a heavier vehicle rolling off an assembly line that same April, months before McNair's death removes the wider resistance surrounding it. What McNair's death does remove is the institutional weight that had been holding back a broader upgunning of American armor across the board. The proposal he had blocked that spring gets revisited within weeks. Deliveries of the new vehicle to Europe, already slowed by training schedules and logistical caution rooted directly in McNair's own doctrine, begin quietly to accelerate. The man who had insisted the existing guns were good enough now lies in the ground at the new American cemetery above Omaha Beach. The gun that was never good enough is, at last, on its way. The gun itself is not, in 1944, a new invention. Its origins go back to the late 1930s, when Army ordnance engineers went looking for a replacement for the aging 3-inch anti-aircraft gun then guarding American skies, a weapon that could no longer reach bombers flying higher and faster than its designers had ever imagined. The result was the 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun, in production by 1940 and standing watch over ports and airfields from the hills above Pearl Harbor to the beaches of Long Island by the following year, capable of throwing a 24-pound shell upward at nearly 3,000 feet a second, high enough to reach any aircraft then flying. From its very first blueprint, the gun was designed to look up at the sky. Sometime in the early summer of 1942, an ordnance engineer whose name has not survived in any surviving record noticed something almost embarrassingly simple. The same velocity that could drive a 90mm shell more than 6 miles into the air would, aimed flat along the ground instead, drive that same shell through nearly any tank then in existence anywhere on Earth. It was in its way an obvious idea sitting in plain sight for years, waiting for the right pair of eyes to fall across the numbers on a firing table and notice what they actually meant on a horizontal line instead of a vertical one. The Army's first attempt to act on that insight was a rushed and unhappy piece of engineering called the T-53, a mounting that bolted the 90mm gun onto an open platform welded to the rear of a Sherman chassis. Approved for production in a moment of near panic in August 1942, over the strenuous objections of the tank destroyer force's own officers, who warned in writing that the design had been rushed past the point of safety, it turned out to be exactly as flawed as those objections had predicted. The mounting was unstable, difficult to aim, and dangerous to its own crew. It was canceled within months, and an even worse follow-up design failed its own testing so badly that the entire rear-mounted concept was abandoned outright. Ordnance engineers went back to the drawing board, and in October of 1942 they tried something different, mounting the 90mm gun inside a newly designed turret and marrying that turret to the hull of the existing M10 tank destroyer, the vehicle already in production and already familiar to the men who would eventually crew it. This time the combination worked. The project received the designation T-71. Take the same reliable hull and running gear already rolling off American assembly lines, discard the M10's existing turret entirely, and build a new one large enough to swallow the bigger gun and its far larger breech. The new turret was left open at the top, a decision made deliberately rather than by accident. A fully enclosed design would have added more than 2 tons to a chassis already straining under the weight of the new gun. Weight, the suspension, and the engine were never built to carry. Leaving the top open kept the vehicle mobile, at the cost of leaving its crew exposed to artillery bursting overhead and to infantry firing down from the upper windows of any town they fought through. That trade-off, mobility purchased with the crew's own safety, would follow the vehicle through every battle it ever fought. Crews who later climbed into the finished machine would come to understand that decision in a very physical way, in the sting of winter wind cutting across an open turret ring at 30 miles an hour, in the way a sudden rain squall left every man inside soaked before anyone could rig a canvas cover, in the particular vulnerability of standing exposed from the waist up while a German infantryman with a rifle took his time finding the range from an upstairs window 2 streets away. Engineers on the project worked through the winter of 1942 into 1943, under enormous pressure, aware that every month spent perfecting the design was another month American crews in North Africa and later in Italy would spend fighting German armor with guns that could not reliably kill it. The finished turret, once it existed, was a strange-looking thing to men used to the low, compact silhouette of the Sherman, tall and slab-sided, with a distinctive counterweight bulge welded to the rear of the turret to balance the sheer weight of the long gun and its breech mechanism at the front. Soldiers who saw it for the first time sometimes mistook the shape for something entirely new, rather than a heavily modified version of a vehicle they already knew. The first T-71 prototype was completed in March of 1943 and taken to the Aberdeen Proving Ground for testing against homogeneous steel plates set at a 30-degree angle, 5 inches thick, then 6, then 7. The gun punched cleanly through every one of them. An ordnance captain watching the trial that day, his name likewise lost to the record, was overheard remarking to a colleague that this would be the end of the German heavy tank. He was wrong in the most literal sense. German heavy tanks would keep rolling across European battlefields for almost 2 more years, but he had glimpsed, without quite knowing it yet, something larger than a single gun, a shift in the balance of the war that neither army would fully understand for a long time to come. Standardized officially as the 90mm gun motor carriage M36 in June of 1944, the vehicle entered full production that same season at the Fisher Body Division's Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan, a sprawling factory that had been turning out armored vehicles at a wartime pace for 2 years already. By July, more than 100 had rolled off the line. By August, more than 300. Almost none of them were anywhere near Europe. They sat instead in stateside motor pools, in rail yards, on the decks of cargo ships crossing a gray and dangerous Atlantic, because a genuinely new vehicle needs new training programs, new ammunition stockpiles, and new logistical planning before it can simply be handed to a battalion already engaged in combat. The Army moved with all the patience of a large institution that had not yet been embarrassed badly enough to hurry. Meanwhile, in the hedgerows of Normandy, and now in the forests along the German frontier, American crews kept dying inside burning Shermans and disabled M10 tank destroyers. Germany, in the aggregate, was losing tanks at a far higher overall rate than the Americans, and American industry could absorb almost any number of losses the campaign demanded. But at the level of a single crew in a single field on a single morning, the Germans were still winning more of these individual duels than they were losing. One well-positioned Panther, dug into a good hedgerow with a clear field of fire, could kill 4 or 5 Shermans before American artillery or a lucky flanking shot finally caught it. That was the brutal arithmetic of 1944. The arithmetic, the Ordnance Department. With McNair now in the ground, and the resistance he represented finally cleared away, had permission at last to change. The first M36's reached the European theater in the final days of September, offloaded at the ports of Cherbourg and Antwerp, and sent forward by rail and by truck convoy to existing tank destroyer battalions that had spent the entire summer fighting in the older M10 Wolverine. The 703rd began converting its companies at the end of the month, one of the first battalions in the theater to do so. Others followed through October, numbered units whose names meant little to anyone outside the men who actually served in them, and who were now about to test a weapon that, even within the Army's own Ordnance Corps, only a fairly narrow circle of officers fully understood. The crews noticed the resemblance to their old M10s immediately. Same hull, same tracks, same cramped driver's compartment. Only the turret was different, larger and more angular, the barrel projecting from its face noticeably longer and thicker than the 76mm gun they had been firing for months. Ordnance memoranda accompanying the earliest deliveries in October carried a consistent instruction for battalion commanders. Engage enemy heavy armor at maximum effective range wherever possible, and give the Germans no clear opportunity to identify what kind of weapon is firing at them. In plain language, the enemy does not yet know what has arrived on this battlefield. Keep it that way as long as possible. Training for the new crews was brief, in some cases barely more than a handful of practice rounds fired at salvaged German hulks dragged out to the edge of a field, a short course on the heavier ammunition, and then straight back to the front line. Some of the men climbing into the new turret had spent months already firing the smaller gun in combat, and greeted the 90mm with open skepticism, having learned the hard way that promises about new equipment rarely survived contact with a real Panther. Others were brand new replacements who had never sat inside a tracked vehicle of any kind before reaching the front, and simply did what they were told. For men in either category, there was a particular unease in climbing into a turret so new that the paint on its interior still smelled faintly of the factory, learning to load a shell nearly a foot longer and considerably heavier than the one they were used to, feeling the whole vehicle rock back on its suspension with a violence the older gun had never produced. Loaders quickly learned to brace themselves against the turret wall before every shot, having been knocked off balance more than once in the first week by the sheer recoil of a gun designed originally to fight aircraft 6 miles overhead. One early complaint proved almost as troublesome as the enemy himself. The gun's enormous muzzle blast, powerful enough to send a shell nearly 3,000 feet a second down the barrel, kicked up such a violent cloud of dust and disturbed air with every shot that gunners frequently lost sight of their own target in the instant after firing, costing precious seconds when a second shot might be needed before an enemy tank could traverse its own turret in reply. It would take until November for ordnance depots to begin fitting a double-baffle muzzle brake to existing vehicles, a modification that cut the blast dramatically and finally let crews see what they had just hit. German assessments of Allied equipment that autumn were built largely from high-altitude reconnaissance photographs and from whatever scraps of captured material happened to fall into German hands during a temporary local advance. And confirmed identification of the M36's true gun does not appear clearly in German frontline intelligence bulletins until the opening weeks of 1945. An analyst studying a grainy aerial photograph of an American motor pool from several thousand feet up could make out a hull shape and a turret outline, sometimes the faint suggestion of a gun barrel, but at that distance and that altitude, he could rarely tell a 90mm barrel from a 76mm one with any confidence. The physical difference between the two is a matter of centimeters, invisible from 6,000 feet through drifting cloud. Faced with that ambiguity, an analyst compared what little he could see against an existing catalog built from earlier reports, found the closest match in the familiar M10 Wolverine, and logged his findings accordingly. The file confirmed what the file already believed. It is a pattern institutions fall into again and again in every century of intelligence work, not through laziness, but through the simple gravitational pull of an existing assumption, and the autumn of 1944 gave the German army no strong reason yet to break out of it. By early December, an unnatural quiet had settled over the Ardennes. The American divisions holding that stretch of line were, in most cases, either exhausted or completely green. The 28th Infantry Division had been ground down badly in the fighting through the Hurtgen Forest and sent to what planners assumed would be a quiet sector to rest and rebuild. The 106th Infantry Division had only just arrived from the United States and had never yet seen a German soldier in the field. Tank destroyer battalions were scattered thinly across this same front, some battle-hardened, some brand new, a handful equipped with the new M36, most still carrying the older guns. Hidden by the fog and by strict radio silence, the largest armored force Germany would ever assemble in the West was already moving into position on the far side of that quiet line. 3 field armies, some 25 divisions, more than 400,000 men, and nearly 700 tanks and assault guns, including among the heaviest units committed to the breakthrough, King Tigers of the 501st and 506th SS Heavy Panzer Battalions. Each tank weighing close to 70 tons, frontal armor a full 6 inches thick and sloped to defeat almost anything fired at it, mounting an 88mm gun capable of killing any Allied vehicle at any range from which that vehicle could conceivably shoot back. Their crews believed, with good reason built on real numbers, that they were driving the most formidable tanks on Earth. They also believed, on the strength of every intelligence briefing handed to them in the preceding months, that American mobile anti-tank weapons topped out at 76mm. Both beliefs were about to be tested in the same week, and only one of them would survive contact with the truth. At 5:30 on the morning of December the 16th, roughly 2,000 German guns opened fire along an 85-mile front. 90 minutes later, the tanks began to roll forward out of the fog. St. Vith sits at a crossroads deep in the eastern Belgian Ardennes, 5 roads converging on one small market town, and in the kind of fast-moving offensive Germany was attempting to fight, those 5 roads were worth more than almost any other piece of ground in the entire sector. Without control of St. Vith, the German timetable simply could not hold. With it, armored columns could pour west toward the Meuse River, in a flood the thin American defenses had no real hope of containing. By the morning of December the 17th, German armor was already driving hard toward the town, defended now by a patchwork force built from the newly arrived 7th Armored Division, survivors filtering back from the shattered 106th Infantry, combat engineers, military police, and gun crews from broken artillery batteries. Anyone at all who could still carry a rifle thrown into the line wherever a gap opened. Attached to the 7th Armored was the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, its companies split between the older M10 and the new M36, crews who in many cases had been holding their new gun for only 6 or 8 weeks. On the afternoon of December the 20th, at roughly 3 o'clock, 3 M36's from Company A of the 814th engaged a column of advancing Panthers east of the town. Firing from concealed positions at ranges the older 76mm gun could never have reached with any real confidence, they destroyed 4 of the lead tanks in the column before withdrawing safely to new ground. A single afternoon's action that would have been simply impossible for any American tank destroyer battalion to carry out 4 months earlier. The snow that day was falling steadily enough to soften the sound of engines until the last possible moment, and the crews found themselves fighting half-blind, judging range as much by the dark shapes emerging from the white haze as by anything visible through a gun sight, wiping frozen breath from their periscopes between shots, with hands that had long since gone numb inside their gloves. That same day, near the village of Charroux, Company B of the same battalion destroyed 2 of the feared Tiger tanks in a separate engagement, further evidence, Had anyone on the German side been able to piece it together in time, that the balance of power on this battlefield had shifted in ways their own intelligence had not yet caught up with. For the men holding the crossroads through those 6 days, the fighting rarely felt like the decisive stand it would later be described as in official histories. It felt instead like a long, exhausting sequence of small, brutal actions. A column spotted through the trees, a few rounds exchanged in the space of a minute, a withdrawal to fresh ground before German artillery could register the position, repeated over and over through days that blurred together in the cold and the dark, with almost no sleep and less food, until the order finally came to pull back across the river to the west. St. Vith held for 6 days against a timetable that had allotted the German army only 2. The delay it imposed did not break the offensive by itself. It was one thread among several, alongside the fuel that Germany's overstretched columns were already beginning to run short of, the American reinforcements pouring into the sector from every direction, and the weather that finally broke clear on December the 23rd, bringing American fighter bombers down onto the German columns like a hammer after a week grounded by cloud too thick for any aircraft to fly through. While St. Vith held in the south, a separate and more famous fight was already unfolding to the north. An SS colonel named Joachim Peiper led the spearhead of the entire German offensive west toward the Meuse, a battle group built around Panthers, half-tracks, infantry, and a company of King Tigers drawn from the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. Peiper's mission was simple to describe on a map and nearly impossible to execute on the ground. Race west, cross the Meuse, and drive on toward Antwerp, along narrow Belgian country roads, and through villages whose stone bridges, his King Tigers, each of them nearing 70 tons, were often too heavy to cross at all, burning fuel at a rate German planners had counted on replacing with captured American depots that never actually fell into their hands. By December the 23rd, Peiper's column was strung out for miles across the Belgian countryside, near the town of Malmedy, American infantry closing in from the north, American armor pressing from the south, and American tank destroyers, the 703rd Battalion's M36's among them, firing into the column from positions the Germans, pinned down by terrain and running dry of fuel, could no longer maneuver to silence. Trapped finally in and around the village of La Glaise, with the weather clear at last, American fighter bombers came down on the position in wave after wave, rockets and bombs turning parked vehicles into pillars of black smoke visible for miles across the snow-covered valley. The concussion of each strike rattling loose plaster from the ceilings of stone farmhouses where German infantry had taken shelter. And on the night of December the 24th, Peiper ordered what remained of his command, several hundred men now moving on foot, to abandon their vehicles and break out eastward through the forest, leaving dozens of armored vehicles behind, many of them simply out of fuel rather than destroyed. German after-action reports written in the days that followed, struggling to explain losses that made little sense against what their own intelligence had told them about American capabilities, sometimes attributed unusually effective American fire to captured or improved ammunition rather than to any weapon they did not already know existed. It was, in a strange way, an easier conclusion to reach than the truth. The gun destroying their tanks at these impossible ranges was not some improved version of a weapon they already understood. It had been a 90mm gun all along, sitting in plain view in reconnaissance photographs for months, simply never recognized for what it was. By the first weeks of January 1945, the German offensive in the Ardennes had already broken its own back, fuel exhaustion finishing what American firepower had begun weeks earlier. It was somewhere in those first cold weeks, in a headquarters bunker on the eastern side of a line that had stopped moving forward, that a German intelligence officer finally read a report he should have been handed back in October. The measurements were unambiguous. The American tank destroyer his own army had spent 4 months mistaking for an old and familiar vehicle carried a 90mm gun. A warning went out from 6th Panzer Army to its subordinate units in those same weeks, instructing every crew to assume American tank destroyers now carried 90mm guns and to treat American mobile anti-tank fire as dangerous at far greater distances than before. By the time that warning reached the men who actually needed it, most of the panzer divisions that had opened the offensive in December had already lost the bulk of their striking power in the retreat back across the German frontier. The information had arrived, in the most literal sense, too late to matter. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a man reading news he ought to have received months earlier, and whoever first opened that bulletin in a cold headquarters bunker in January would have understood exactly what it represented: the closing paragraph of a 4-month institutional failure, the quiet confession of a system that had photographed a new American vehicle from 6,000 feet and looked directly at it, and somehow gone on seeing the old one. Among the officers who had commanded the King Tiger battalions thrown into that failed offensive was the man leading the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, the same unit whose tanks had fought and burned around St. Vith in December. By March of 1945, the once formidable battalion he commanded existed mostly on paper, its surviving King Tigers scattered, abandoned, or destroyed across 2 failed offensives in 2 different countries, its ranks filled with replacements who had trained on tanks they would only see for the first time in the confusion of retreat. He did not survive the war by much. Relieved of his command in mid-March, in the closing weeks of the fighting in Hungary, he took his own life on March the 19th, 1945, near the town of Veszprém, at the age of 33, worn down, by most surviving accounts, by months of physical strain, and by the visible collapse of the army he had spent the war serving. 2 things need saying plainly before this story can end, because both of them change the meaning of everything that came before. The first concerns the gun itself. When post-war ordnance officers sat down after the war and compared the original Aberdeen test figures against the actual combat reports gathered across Europe, a clearer and considerably less cinematic picture emerged than the wartime legend suggested. The standard armor-piercing round fired from the 90mm gun could penetrate roughly 120 millimeters of 30-degree sloped armor at 500 yards, something closer to 108 millimeters at 1,000 yards, about 91 millimeters at 2,000 yards, and considerably less at 3,000. Set those figures against a King Tiger's frontal glacis plate, some 150 millimeters thick, and sloped sharply enough to present an effective thickness against a level shot well beyond 200 millimeters, and the picture becomes clear. A standard round fired at 2,000 yards could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of a King Tiger. It could barely do so at half that range. A newer tungsten cored round, considerably more powerful, could defeat that same frontal armor, but only at ranges under roughly 500 yards, and only with a precisely placed shot. And even then, supplies of that ammunition remained scarce through the winter of the fighting described here. The popular image of the M36 reaching calmly across 3,000 yards of open snow and punching a clean hole through a King Tiger's turret is, in the plainest possible terms, a myth. Its real killing ground against the heaviest German armor sat much closer, somewhere between 800 and 1,500 yards, and usually required a shot aimed at the thinner armor of a tank's side or rear rather than its front. What the 90mm gun actually offered was not some impossible miracle of range, but a genuine and previously non-existent chance, at distances no earlier American vehicle could have survived reaching, to fight German heavy armor on something closer to even terms. For the loader bracing himself against the recoil in a snow-filled turret outside St. Vith, none of these later calculations would have meant much in the moment. What mattered was simpler and far more immediate: the crack of the gun, the shudder through the hull, and the sight of smoke rising from a tank that 4 months earlier his own crew would never have dared engage at that distance at all. The second thing is harder to state plainly, because it runs against the grain of 80 years of retelling. In the years after the war, when surviving crewmen who had operated both the M36 and the earlier, lighter M18 tank destroyer were asked which vehicle they had actually trusted more in combat, many of them did not choose the one with the bigger gun. The M18 was faster, capable of speeds the M36's heavier chassis could never approach, smaller, and considerably harder for a German gunner to hit in the first place. Its gun was less powerful, but adequate against the great majority of targets a crew actually faced in the ordinary run of combat, and its lighter weight let it cross soft ground and thin bridges the heavier M36 sometimes could not use at all. In the kind of war these men were actually fighting, built around ambush, quick displacement, and short bursts of extreme violence, followed by long stretches of waiting, plenty of veterans said afterward that speed had mattered to their own survival at least as much as raw, penetrating power ever did. That verdict does not fit comfortably into the version of this story usually told in books and documentaries, the version that says bigger guns simply won the war outright. The men who actually crewed these vehicles, when asked plainly decades later, tended to offer something more complicated, more honest, and considerably less cinematic. By the spring of 1945, the M36 had been credited with the destruction of several hundred German armored vehicles across the campaign in northwest Europe, a figure that remains an estimate rather than an exact count, since wartime reporting was never perfect, and not every kill could be cleanly traced back to a specific weapon on a specific afternoon. Among those losses were a meaningful number of King Tigers, a small contribution set against the far larger tally the Eastern Front had already inflicted on Germany's heaviest tanks, but disproportionate to the M36's own modest numbers in the West, since it was killing at ranges nothing else in the American arsenal could reach, forcing German heavy armor onto the defensive at exactly the moment its own doctrine called for it to attack, and quietly denying the King Tiger the psychological dominance it had been designed from its very first blueprint to project onto any battlefield it entered. Nearly all of it was accomplished across almost 4 months, without the German army ever fully understanding what weapon was actually killing its tanks. The vehicle itself outlived the war that produced it by decades. The United States Army used it briefly again in Korea in the early 1950s, before judging it obsolete against newer Soviet-built armor, while the Republic of Korea's own army fielded roughly 200 examples across 9 tank companies through that same war. France carried M36's into its long and difficult war in Indochina in the years that followed. Yugoslavia received several hundred, later fitting many of them with Soviet-built diesel engines, and those same aging vehicles were still being used decades afterward in the wars that tore that country apart in the early 1990s. Taiwan's army acquired a small number of former French examples in the mid-1950s, stationing them on the island of Kinmen, where they saw combat as recently as the tense weeks of the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1958. A weapon designed in a Michigan factory to kill King Tigers in the snow outside a Belgian crossroads town, still standing guard on a small island off the coast of China more than a decade later. It is tempting, telling a story like this one, to make the M36 into a simple hero, and its gun into a wonder weapon that single-handedly turned the tide. The men who actually climbed into its turret would likely have laughed at that framing, and some of them, interviewed decades later, plainly did. What actually won this particular contest was closer to the opposite of a wonder weapon, a country able to build thousands of these vehicles, while its enemy struggled to build a few hundred of its heaviest tanks, an industrial and logistical machine that could recover from a single catastrophic doctrinal mistake within months rather than years. And thousands of ordinary men in numbered battalions most people have never heard of, who kept climbing into open-top turrets and aiming a new gun at an enemy they had spent 4 straight months being told, wrongly, that they could not beat. If a relative of yours served in a tank destroyer battalion anywhere in this story, at Morton, at St. Vith, or in the long cold chase after Kampfgruppe Peiper through the Belgian snow, share whatever they told you about it in the comments below. Most of these men never wrote memoirs, never sat for a formal interview, and never thought what they had done was remarkable enough to write down. The record of what they actually did remains thinner than it deserves to be.